In 1970, the average American home cost $23,000. The average salary was $9,400. You could buy a house with 2.4 years of income. In 2026, the average home costs $430,000. The average salary is $60,000. That's 7.2 years of income. But that's not the full story. This is why it feels impossible. Not emotionally impossible, mathematically impossible. And when you factor in interest rates, down payments, and rent draining your savings, the real gap isn't 3 times. It's closer to 10 times. Your parents bought homes at 25. You're 35 and still renting. They paid off mortgages in 15 years. You're looking at 30-year debt if you can even qualify. This isn't about avocado toast. This isn't about work ethic. This is about a system that was deliberately restructured between 1971 and 2008 to transfer homeownership from the middle class to investors. And once you see exactly how it happened, year by year, policy by policy, you'll understand why you can't afford what your parents took for granted. This is the story of how America's housing market was turned into a wealth extraction machine, and why your generation is locked out by design. Let's start with what your parents had. Not nostalgia. Data. 1970. The housing baseline. In 1970, a 30-year-old making median income could afford the median home. The numbers were simple. Median home price, $23,000. Median household income, $9,400. Price to income ratio, 2.4. Here's what that meant in practice. With a 20% down payment, $4,600, and a 30-year mortgage at 7.5% interest, your monthly payment was about $160. That's 20% of median monthly income. Affordable, achievable, and banks would lend to you. Stable job, 20% down. Reasonable debt. Approved. Home ownership rates in 1970, 64%. 2/3 of American families owned their homes, and most bought them young. The average first-time home buyer in 1970 was 26 years old. 26. Not because they were smarter or worked harder, because the system was designed to make home ownership accessible. Let me show you how. Post-war housing policy. After World War II, the U.S. government wanted to avoid another Great Depression. The solution: stimulate the economy through housing. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, guaranteed home loans to veterans. No down payment required. Low fixed interest rates. Millions of veterans bought homes. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, provided mortgage insurance. This made banks willing to lend to middle-class families who didn't have large down payments. Suburbs were built by the thousands. Levittown, New York, entire communities designed for ownership. Mass production made homes cheap. A Levittown house cost $8,000 in 1950. That's $100,000 today. Jobs were plentiful. Wages were rising, and housing was treated as a place to live, not a financial asset. The result: the largest expansion of middle-class home ownership in American history. Between 1940 and 1960, home ownership rates rose from 44% to 62%. An entire generation bought homes, built equity, and passed wealth to their children. This was the baseline. The America your parents inherited. But it didn't last. Because between 1971 and 2008, the system was restructured, deliberately, piece by piece. And by the time you were old enough to buy, the game had completely changed. Here's what happened. 4 major shifts. Each one made housing more expensive and harder to access. Shift 1. 1971, wages decoupled from productivity. In 1971, Richard Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was no longer tied to gold. It became pure fiat currency. At the same time, something else broke: the link between productivity and wages. From 1948 to 1973, when worker productivity increased 97%, wages increased 91%. They moved together. After 1973, they diverged. From 1973 to 2023, productivity increased 77%. Wages increased just 12%. What does this mean for housing? It means workers produced more value but didn't get paid more. The extra wealth went to profits, to shareholders, to asset owners. When wages stagnate, housing should become more affordable relative to income. Instead, it moved in the opposite direction because of shifts 2, 3, and 4. Shift 2. 1980s. Financialization of housing. In the 1980s, housing stopped being treated as a place to live and started being treated as a financial asset. Mortgage-backed securities were created. Banks could bundle mortgages, sell them to investors, and use the cash to make more loans. This was supposed to increase lending capacity and lower rates, but it had another effect. It turned housing into a commodity. Homes stopped being places to live and became vehicles for return. Once housing became an asset class, capital flooded in. By the 1990s, institutional investors were buying residential properties in bulk. Private equity firms and large institutional investors. They weren't buying to live. They were buying to rent, to flip, to extract. And when investors enter a market, they drive up prices because they're competing with families and they have more capital. Shift 3, 2000s, subprime lending and the housing bubble. In the early 2000s, banks started offering subprime mortgages, loans to people who couldn't afford traditional mortgages, adjustable rates, no down payment, no income verification. Why? Because banks were selling the mortgages to investors anyway. They didn't hold the risk. This flooded the market with buyers. Demand surged. Prices exploded. From 2000 to 2006, median home prices rose 60%. People who couldn't afford homes were taking out loans. Speculators were flipping properties. And everyone believed prices would keep rising forever. They didn't. In 2008, the bubble burst. Home prices collapsed. Millions of foreclosures. The financial system nearly imploded. This should have been a reset. Prices should have crashed and stayed low. First-time buyers should have had an opportunity. They didn't. Because of Shift 4. Shift 4, 2008 to 2020. The Federal Reserve saved investors, not buyers. After 2008, the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to zero and launched quantitative easing. They printed trillions of dollars and used it to buy mortgage-backed securities. The goal? Stabilize the housing market. The result? Housing prices recovered. Fast. By 2012, prices were rising again. By 2019, they'd surpassed pre-crisis peaks. But who benefited? Not first-time buyers. Investors. Because while prices were low in 2009 to 2011, banks weren't lending to regular buyers. Credit was tight. Down payment requirements were high. Approval was difficult. But institutional investors had cash, and they bought tens of thousands of foreclosed homes at bargain prices. Blackstone, the largest private equity firm in the world, spent $10 billion buying 80,000 homes between 2012 and 2017. Invitation Homes, American Homes, For Rent, Progress Residential, all bought thousands of properties. They didn't buy to sell, they bought to rent. And this is the key. When investors buy homes to rent, they remove inventory from the ownership market permanently. Families who would have bought those homes now have to rent. from the same investors who bought the homes they can't afford. This is the system working exactly as designed. Housing prices recover, investors profit, and the middle class is locked out. Let's bring it to today, 2026, the housing market your generation faces. This is where the math breaks. The numbers tell the story. Median home price, $430,000. Median household income, $60,000. Price-to-income ratio, 7.2. In 1970, it was 2.4. That means housing is 3 times more expensive relative to income than it was for your parents. But it's worse than that, because interest rates are higher now. In 1970, mortgage rates were 7.5%. In 2020, they were 3%. In 2026, they're 7%. Higher rates mean higher monthly payments. A $430,000 home with 20% down, $86,000, and a 7% mortgage costs $2,280 per month. That's 45% of median monthly income. In 1970, it was 20%. So housing costs have more than doubled as a percentage of income. But there's more. Down payments. In 1970, 20% down on a $23,000 home was $4,600. That's about half a year's salary. In 2026, 20% down on a $430,000 home is $86,000. That's 1.4 years of salary, nearly 3 times harder to save. And it's harder to save because rent is more expensive. In 1970, median rent was $108 per month. That's 14% of median income. In 2026, median rent is $1,750 per month. That's 35% of median income. So you're paying more in rent, which makes it harder to save for a down payment, which makes it harder to buy. Renting drains savings. And without savings, ownership stays out of reach. This is by design. Who owns housing now? Here's the final piece. In 1970, 64% of Americans owned homes. Most were families. In 2026, home ownership is 66%, slightly higher. But who owns the homes has changed. Institutional investors now own 30% of single-family rental homes in major metro areas. In some cities, Phoenix, Atlanta, Charlotte, they own over 40%. These are homes that used to be owned by families. Now they're owned by Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and American Homes for rent. And they're not selling. Why would they? Rents keep rising. Home values keep rising. And they can borrow cheaply to buy more. They're not in the business of home ownership. They're in the business of rent extraction. And every home they buy is one less home available for you. The generational wealth gap. Here's what this means long-term. Your parents bought homes at 26. By the time they were 50, their homes were paid off, or nearly paid off. That home appreciated in value. In many cases, 5 times to 10 times. A home bought for $23,000 in 1970 is worth $400,000 today in many markets. That's $377,000 in wealth accumulation. Just from owning a home. They used that wealth to retire, to help their kids, to pass down inheritance. But if you can't buy until you're 35, and that's if you can buy at all, you've lost 10 years of appreciation. And if you're paying 45% of your income instead of 20%, you have less money to invest elsewhere. The wealth gap isn't just about income. It's about asset ownership. And housing is the largest asset most Americans will ever own. Your parents' generation built wealth through home ownership. Your generation is locked out. You might be thinking, can't we fix this? Can't policy change? Theoretically, yes. But here's why it won't. The system benefits the powerful. Who profits from expensive housing? Banks. They make money on larger mortgages and higher interest payments. Investors. Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and others profit from rising rents and home values. Existing homeowners. If you already own a home, rising prices increase your wealth. Local governments. Higher property values mean higher property tax revenue. The only group that loses is first-time buyers, and that's why understanding this matters. Systems only change once enough people can clearly explain why they're broken, even if they start with the least political power. Policies that could fix it won't pass. What would actually make housing affordable? Ban or heavily tax institutional investors buying single-family homes. This would free up inventory, massively increase housing supply, build millions of new homes, restrict foreign investment in U.S. real estate. Chinese, Canadian, and European buyers drive up prices in major cities, cap rent increases, protect renters from exploitation. Why won't these happen? Because every policy hurts someone powerful. Banning institutional investors? Blackstone and others lobby against it. Building more housing? Existing homeowners oppose new construction. It lowers their property values. Restricting foreign investment? Real estate industry profits from it. Capping rents? Landlords and investors oppose it. The people who could fix the problem benefit from it staying broken. Zoning laws. Lock-in scarcity. Most U.S. cities have restrictive zoning laws. Single-family zoning, height limits, density restrictions. These laws were created to preserve neighborhood character, but they prevent new housing construction. In many U.S. cities, it takes years, sometimes a decade, just to get approval to build housing at all. Zoning creates artificial scarcity, and scarcity drives up prices. But changing zoning requires local government approval, and local homeowners vote against it. Because new housing lowers their property values, so the system is locked, politically, economically, structurally. What actually happens next? Here's the likely future. Homeownership rates will continue to decline for people under 40. More families will rent permanently. Investors will own a larger share of housing stock. Generational wealth transfer will accelerate. The children of homeowners will inherit wealth. The children of renters won't. This will create a permanent class divide. Property owners and renters. Wealth and precarity. And once that divide is entrenched, it's nearly impossible to reverse. So what do? You can't change the system alone, but you can understand it and make better decisions within it. Option 1. Buy anyway, even if it's hard. If you can possibly buy, do it. Even if it means buying in a cheaper city or suburb, buying a smaller home than you want. Stretching your budget uncomfortably, using FHA loans with 3.5% down, because even a small home builds equity. Even in a less desirable area, homes appreciate. The gap between renters and owners only widens over time. Option 2. Invest in what you can't own. If you can't buy a home, buy shares in the companies that own homes. Blackstone, Invitation Homes, American Homes. For rent, they're publicly traded. This isn't endorsement, it's defense. If the system extracts wealth from renters, the least you can do is make sure your savings aren't losing to it. Option 3. Leave high-cost markets. Housing costs vary wildly by location. In San Francisco, median home price, $1.4 million. In Austin, $550,000. In Cleveland, $220,000. If you can work remotely, move to a cheaper market. Your income might be the same, but your housing costs drop by 50 to 70%. This is the geographic arbitrage, and it's one of the few advantages your generation has. Option 4. Advocate for change. Vote for politicians who support zoning reform, banning institutional investors from buying single-family homes, taxing vacant properties, building public housing. Change is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And the more people understand the system, the more pressure builds for reform. Your parents bought homes at 26 with 2.4 years of income. You're 35, facing 7.2 years of income, with higher interest rates, higher down payments, and institutional investors buying up inventory. This isn't your fault. This is a system that was restructured between 1971 and 2008 to benefit investors and lock out the middle class. Wages decoupled from productivity in 1971. Housing was financialized in the 1980s. The 2008 bailout saved investors, not buyers. And now institutional investors own 30% of rental homes in major cities. The American dream of homeownership isn't dead. It's just reserved for people who already have wealth. If this video showed you exactly why you can't afford what your parents took for granted, subscribe. Because the housing crisis isn't the only system designed to extract wealth from your generation. Student debt, healthcare costs, retirement insecurity. They're all connected. They're all deliberate. And they're all designed the same way. I'll show you how each one works. And why understanding the system is the only way to navigate it. The answers aren't hiding, they're just not taught. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Subscribe, because the next crisis is already being built, and you'll want to see it coming.